I said, my name's Alison Fitzgerald. I'm currently hiding from my kids in my backyard. As, as we all know, being home now is a little less work than possible. Um, so when I agreed to talk with Sally a couple of months ago, I was very excited about this because I always love talking to people about oysters. I could probably talk for hours on this topic. We go out to the field and I just love connecting with the volunteers. I love talking to everyone. I love hearing your stories and why you want to come out. It's a big part of why I got into this work, was to connect with the volunteers. I love talking science about oysters, but I also love teaching science about oysters. So if you don't know a lot, you're going to learn stuff. I'm not a huge oyster eater, which people find really weird sometimes. They're either freaked out that I do eat them at all, or they're mad that I don't eat them. But they're okay. They're not my favorite. But part of the reason that we do restoration in New York is to talk about all the other amazing things that oysters can do besides taste good. Because we are actually not doing restoration for aquaculture. The oysters that we put into New York Harbor don't come out onto our plates. That's a very important fact that we stress whenever we give talks like this, because there are people who don't realize that you could actually get sick eating these oysters. And it's very important that we stress that what we're putting in is for the other amazing benefits of oysters, for how they clean the water, for the biodiversity that they add to the environment, for the stabilizing shorelines. All of that is so important. And it's just an extra thing that they do. So I'm going to share my screen, and we just did this before, so hopefully it works again. Okay. I'm getting banged on the door. They're waving at me from the inside. That's me in the oyster, in the waders there. And that is what Sally said. When we go out into the field, I don't do all the work and talk to you. You do the work and talk to me. I have you get into the water. I have waders for everyone. We go out. When we go out to the site on low tide, it's probably anywhere between knee and hip height, depending on how tall you are. And we reach down and grab the oysters from the bottom in our baskets, and we talk about everything that's living there, all the biodiversity, the crabs, the fish, the worms, anything that moves, we talk about. We talk about the area that we're located in. We talk about CSOs and pollution. We talk about the history of oysters in New York, all of that whenever we go out, because learning about where we've been is important to learn about where we're going. You know, you guys are all interested in starting a project at City Island. Knowing the history of it, from why New York is so into oysters to begin with, but also all of the, I don't want to say mistakes because it's not always bad, but we've tried a lot of things. And some things work and some things work differently, and some things work better and some things didn't work at all. And learning the history of restoration in New York and kind of seeing where that road has taken all of us practitioners over the last 2 decades is important, because you can use that information to find your own path. So you can assess your site, learn about what worked in Soundview, what worked in other places in the harbor, what's working now at Tappan Zee Bridge, all of those things, and use that information for your own benefit. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you should learn where the wheel's been. So I wanted to talk about that. We'll talk about a little bit about oysters and the history in New York. We'll talk about the projects that we've done before this, our partners, and kind of where we're going, where we planned to be going pre-COVID, and a little bit about what's going to happen now after that. So everyone on this call knows oysters are cool. A quick Google search in New York shows you that New York has a love affair with oysters. They're pretty awesome. It actually is very rare to find a pearl in the oysters that we eat. These are what's called Chrysostrea virginica, which is your eastern oyster. And while every bivalve can make a pearl, any bivalve, clams, mussels, you name it, they can make a pearl. It's kind of rare to find them in virginicas. They just don't make them a lot. The oysters that you get pearls out of are called pinctada oysters. They are Asian oysters, usually from like the Pacific Ocean, and they make nicer pearls. The ones that are in virginica aren't that big or anything. I had a volunteer once that was a gemologist. She studied gems and her specialty was pearls. That's how she got into volunteering. And I learned so much about pearls in 2 years of meeting her. She was fabulous. So you can see here all these things. This last one that I dropped in on the bottom came out probably in the fall last year, which is part of the next phase at Soundview, which we are very excited to be a part of, where the governor is moving forward with his Restore New York plan, and it's going to talk about, ecology mostly, and a big part of that is restoring oysters in the Hudson River. So oysters were a big part of the Hudson River forever. There were actually more oysters in the Hudson River than any other bay in the United States, bigger than Chesapeake Bay. We had a vibrant oyster industry until the very early 1900s. You can see in that picture there, people actually used to buy oysters like they would buy hot dogs on the street. You would just buy oysters and clams. They were everywhere. You could reach in the water and grab them out. If you're really interested in the history of oysters, and you haven't heard of this book, it's actually really great. I liked it a lot. And it'll give you some really good facts about just the history of oysters in New York Harbor itself. We, as New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, we are focused on the lower Hudson River, New York Bay, and then all around the boroughs to Sandy Hook. And I'll go through that a little bit more. So there were like 300 million oysters all in this area. I'm getting distracted. And so that's why it's so important to think about putting oysters back in. They were a huge part of the culture in New York, not just the ecology. There are many books and history professors and newspaper articles and news things that are all dedicated to this. If you're interested in looking into it more. The oysters back then were huge. We don't find them that big anymore. We have occasionally, as you saw in one of those news clips, they found some old big ones in the Hudson River a few years ago. But what's really important is this map over here. If you see this map on the left, you can see all that pink and green shading in there. Those are what's called wetlands. Wetlands is where the estuary would flood onto the water. Think like a salt marsh or something. And wetlands are really important in wave mitigation. You know how Hurricane Sandy came in and kind of flooded all of lower New York? It's because the wetlands aren't there anymore, so it couldn't slow down wave attenuation. What is becoming a more researched and popular shoreline, instead of doing these hardened shorelines, is to do what's called a living shoreline. And that's what a oyster bed is. Oysters, salt marshes, they're all what's called a living shoreline. They slow down the wave action before it gets on shore, and it helps to prevent from it all kind of going over the bulkhead and flooding onto the streets, which is what happened. Because of all these wetlands that were there and all these oyster beds, it's a very diverse area. Fish like to live in those areas because there's lots of food for them. Juvenile fish like to live there because there's protection from big predators that can't come into these tidal areas. If it's tidal, that means that the water's gonna go from like a low tide, it'll come out, then it'll flush back in a high tide. So the level's gonna change during the day, and that's gonna affect the organisms that live there. But the juvenile fish love it. So these were really abundant fishing grounds, great places to go find oysters. You could walk in and get your dinner. All of those areas in pink are gone. That's how much wetland we've lost since the early 1800s, okay? The areas in green are still there, but they're very degraded. There's no healthy marshes in this area anymore. This big pink plot here, this is all of, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's a lot of the wetlands here, even if they are green, aren't true they're not true Spartina wetlands, the native species. They've been taken over by Phragmites, which is an invasive species. And so with that loss comes this change of the basic ecology of the estuary. And even if there were oysters around and they weren't overfished, they lost their habitat, and that's really important. Okay, so by the early 1800s, there were no natural oyster beds anymore. These 300 million acres were gone. Okay, the reason that they were gone is that oystermen didn't know about oyster biology when they first started fishing. So they would take out the whole oyster, the shells, everything would all just come up in these tongs. They'd remove it. You can see these big shell piles there. They didn't know that oysters need those shells to keep growing. An oyster reef grows on top of the old reef, and it keeps growing up and up. And they couldn't see that, or they didn't know that at the time. And so they removed this hard substrate, and the oysters couldn't stick to the mud. So they couldn't grow in just the mud. When we find native oysters now in New York, they're usually stuck to a tire or a brick or the side of a bridge. We don't find them growing up in these healthy reefs that I'll show you a picture of later. It's because we took out all the shells now. You may have seen around New York signs about shell recycling in some restaurants. The Billion Oyster Project is doing a shell recycling program. Why do we want to recycle shells? Because we need to put that hard substrate back into the water to be able to attract more oysters to set on it. If we don't have anything hard there for them, they're going to float away. Okay. Oh, I should have said this. So in addition to the loss of the hard substrate, there was some diseases that came in, both oyster diseases and human diseases. People were getting sick from pollution on top of the oyster reef, doing things like typhoid fever and using all of the oyster beds. And oysters are now what we term functionally extinct. There aren't enough oysters to do the ecology that they're. Why are oysters so great? I was very upbeat when I was writing this talk, apparently. So the ecology part of oysters is that they're able to clean the water. And I have to clarify that because I get a lot of questions about this. Well, if oysters can clean the water, are they pulling the pollution out? Not necessarily. What it means by when we say cleaning the water is that they pull particulates out. So one of the problems with water in the harbor is that it has a lot of suspended sediment in it. There's, you know, the harbor was dredged. They put these big ships in and they dredged out the harbor. And so there's a lot of sediment that just kept being stirred up by waves and by boats going by and, you know, sediment pouring in offshore during storms. So the water's very cloudy. Okay. What oysters do is they pull that out of the water and they make it very clear. Okay. Do they remove all of the pollutants? They can remove some of them that are stuck to the sediments, but then it just ends up inside the oyster's body. Okay. So that's part of why we don't want to eat them. Same thing with bacteria. If you have a lot of bacteria that's in the water from like a CSO, it could get removed by the oysters, but it ends up in the oyster's body. And so again, we don't want to eat them. You can see in this picture on the bottom, it's a really great infographic that shows you how the oysters are pulling the algae out of the water and what they can do to it. So on the left here, you can see this is what an oyster reef would look like if it was healthy. A reef builds up. It's 3D, like a coral reef, okay? And in those 3D structures, there's little hidey holes for crabs and worms are swimming around and fish are there. And so because of that, the oysters are so healthy, they're filtering all of the suspended solids out. They're filtering their plankton, which is their food, and they're putting it all down on the ground into the benthos. Okay, it's making everything very clean. When we lose the oysters, either via pollution or being removed, whatever the case is, we kind of lose the pelagic coupling. Benthic means bottom, pelagic means top or the water, and coupled together. That's what oysters do. They pull the top down to the bottom. And you can see here, when we have all of these stressors, whether the water's too warm or the salinity is not right, or we have low oxygen, right? Ocean acidification, all of these stressors, and the oysters die off, we lose that coupling, which leads to the water being dirtier, okay? So we talk about cleaning it in terms of clarity. Oysters are termed ecosystem engineers. They build a structure just by living that becomes a habitat for other organisms. Salt marshes do this, mangrove trees do this, even just a regular forest is an ecosystem engineer. They are nursery grounds, they're refugia, which means a place to hide. We often find small fish hiding in our basket. Okay? And they're really important for shoreline stabilization. They're gonna protect the shoreline from those waves, keep sediment accreting. So to accrete means to build up. So we'll kind of pile on sediment behind them to stabilize that salt marsh so it won't wash away, okay? Everything is kind of stabilizing the shore. It also acts as a filter, the wetland. So if you have a healthier wetland, it'll prevent all the toxins from your streets that are washing off from going into the ocean. Something really important that you should know about oysters is their reproductive cycle, okay? If we are going to restore oysters and you can't get them to reproduce successfully, you're just gonna have to keep putting adult oysters in the water every single year. It would be very expensive and very time consuming. Okay, so understanding the reproductive cycle is very important. When you have adult oysters, they do what's called mass spawning. Males release sperm into the water column, females release eggs all at the same time. The egg and sperm find each other in the, floating in the top of the water. They become a veliger, okay? which becomes a larva, which will then eventually, after about 2 weeks, settle down and become a spat. And you can see a tiny little spat on there. By the time we find them, they're a little bit bigger. It's maybe about a month after they settle down before we can even see them enough to find them. And they'll start growing up. You can see on the picture down here, we had a whole lot of spat that landed on a tire and started growing. Oysters need hard substrate. Those larvae won't settle down onto sand. They won't grow well with that. They'll suck it in too much. They need to be above the sediment and on something hard. They like sticking to another shell, okay? They also need a minimum population to reproduce. There's something in population genetics called minimum viable population, but it basically means if you don't have enough males and females to kind of trigger each other, they need to release their hormones, they won't reproduce. Unfortunately, New York is kind of close to that. There are very few wild oysters, okay? So we're not sure. There are some pockets that do have a nice population that seem to be supplying spat to the estuary, especially upriver in the Hudson. They're doing a lot of studies on that right now, actually, some really great studies. We also get larvae at Soundview and probably on City Island. A lot of it might come from the Long Island Sound, where they have several successful oyster farms and industry. And so all of that is going to be necessary if you want to keep your population going. You want to be able to find it. I think Sally mentioned that you guys do find a lot of spat there and you put out bags and you saw that they can grow. So that's great. That's already like one step closer. So we talked about the oysters disappearing and how it's really bad. And I kind of mentioned that a lot of it was with overharvesting and the loss of those shells, right? Diseases, close it for good. And this was all probably before the early 1920s, right? But the estuary didn't really get healthier again until the Clean Water Act, okay? After the Clean Water Act, people started cleaning up. As you know, I don't think you can turn on social media or the news lately without hearing about some cleanup or recycling program or anti-plastic or anything. And all of that is really important to keeping the estuary clean so that we can bring these oysters back. I have found oysters, that picture on the bottom is oysters settled on a piece of like a car engine that I found at Soundview. We find them on tires. I found them on beer cans. They will settle onto anything. And so the more we can clean up the water and put shells back in, the healthier populations we can have. So oyster restoration in New York City is a really abundant and vibrant topic that I love talking about. It's probably started for real in the early 2000s, maybe even a little bit before that. People started doing what's called oyster gardening. Oyster gardening is an excellent educational tool. I know you guys have talked about that up in City Island, where you can actually take a cage of oysters and kind of follow them through a year and you look at them grow. Is an amazing tool for teaching science to kids. You learn all about the oyster life cycle, about data measurement and collection and all these things. And you can see in this map here with the red dots, those are all places where there have been oyster restoration projects since the early 2000s, okay? That's pretty amazing. That's a lot of places. If you think about how much money and time it takes to start running these projects, that's really awesome. Not all of them have been extremely successful. Not all of them are still ongoing. You can see some of those dates are end dates. But right now we have some really great projects going on in Soundview Park. I know that there are some active projects in Jamaica Bay and in Staten Island. And of course, there's the large Living Shoreline project that's going to go off Staten Island in a few years. And of course, we have an active site in Raritan Bay at Naval Weapons Station Earl. All of these are places where we can keep moving the restoration science forward and seeing where we can add new information in so that we can kind of, how do I want to say this? Put the most oysters into the water and get that ecological function that we want to see. Okay, we need a volume to be able to produce the ecological function that we're looking for, to have the oysters filtering at a rate and a capacity that's going to impact the water, okay, to have a large enough population that they're going to reproduce. to be able to attract fish to spawn and to nursery there. Okay? So we need to put like a large volume of oysters in each time. Again, the restoration is for ecological purposes. It's not for food, and it kind of brings up this unique discussion about restoration versus rehabilitation. We talk about this a lot at Baykeeper. To restore something means to put it back to the way it was. We're not going back to the Henry Hudson days of the Harbor Estuary. We're not able to anymore. But how can we rehabilitate this population and make it the best that it can be? How can we involve citizens? How can we involve science? How can we make the public aware of what we're doing so that they care about it? I mean, these are all really important topics that we talk about. Okay. So the Harbor Estuary offers some unique challenges. It is a very urban estuary, as you all know. We live around it, and so it really does offer these challenges to restoration that we don't see in other places. If we were going to try to compare what we do to anywhere else, we would look to Chesapeake Bay, that has a very robust restoration program. We might look north to Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, or even Great Bay in New Hampshire. They've done restoration all along the Gulf of Mexico, but New York is different. We are different than all those places. We may have some things in common with them, but as a whole, the habitat alteration, the pollution inputs, the CSOs, all of that combined population leads it to be a unique situation. It's hard to study some things because of this. We're still working on good larval transport studies. I know there is some work being done recently or coming up that's looking at modeling. We do like hydrodynamic modeling. I say we as a community, not me personally. But the loss of substrate plus the habitat and the low population, all of this gives us these unique challenges. Thankfully, everyone who works on restoration in New York is kind of tight, and we share information and we work together. We have lots of partners. And so the community of scientists that are working on all of this is our best weapon. Us together, working together, is the best weapon that we have to try to really tackle this problem. Okay, so I love this graphic. This is what an oyster reef should look like, and this is a true reef. The top one is in Virginia on the bottom of Chesapeake Bay. The bottom one is in North Carolina, and you can see these oysters, they're growing up. Like if you were to point your hand up towards the sky, they grow upwards. Okay, the oysters are able to filter better that way. They're stuck together. They're landing on top of each other. They're spread out. Yes, it's a little muddy, but that's okay. This is what a real reef would look like. And that is a restored reef. Okay, that's not a natural one. This is a restored reef. This is what our reefs look like. Okay, so when we use the term reef, we use it very loosely. But you can see here, we use baskets with loose shell. We use the castles. So those cinder blocks in the middle are called oyster castles. They're cement structures that we can set oysters directly on to help jumpstart the reef. We use gabions, which are metal cages that hold oysters and oyster spat in them to help jumpstart the reef. We need to do these things because we are missing the habitat structure and the base population that these other estuaries have. Okay, so by using these cement or metal structures, you're able to kind of give the 3D shape of the reef a little head start, and it provides a place for now when your oysters spawn or when larvae that's already in the system comes by, they can land on that. So just a quick little blurb about New York, New Jersey Baykeeper. We are an advocate. It's a part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. If you've heard of the Hudson River Keeper or Hackensack River Keeper, Long Island Sound Keeper, they're all part of the same alliance. And we provide public access, or we advocate for public access to fishable, swimmable, clean waterways on the shorelines of all the boroughs of New York City and North Central Jersey, so basically down to Sandy Hook. In terms of our restoration program, we have 2 active sites, Soundview Park, which I'm going to talk to you about, and that's very close to City Island. And I'll give you a quick overview of our other site in New Jersey, which is actually at a secure naval weapons base, and I'll tell you about that. We also run a small aquaculture facility in New Jersey. We have the citizen science program, the EcoVolunteers. We have some living shorelines projects, and we do a lot of research projects too. We're really working on collecting data to share with our partners and with all of the interested parties so we can help move the science forward. If you are interested, the link's right there and I can send it to Sally. Oh, and the little brown dots in this picture right there that kind of look like sand grains, that's actually spat from our aquaculture facility. They are very, very small when we put them in the water, very tiny, but they do grow, and we've had a very nice survival at Earl, which is where we use these spat for. So I wanted to talk to you about Soundview Park. Soundview Park is in the Bronx. Like Sally said, I've actually been working there for like 13 years. I started as an intern at New York City Parks when I first started my PhD. I worked there in 2007, and New York City Parks, the Natural Resources Group, they were really the first people who started doing oyster restoration in the Bronx. Really one of the first ones in the harbor. They had this natural population there that was a decent size, and people had kept calling them and being like, I was fishing on the water and I saw oysters down there, and they went down and checked it out, and they said, well, if these are surviving here, what can we study? Let's see if we can put some shell bags in there and find some spat. Let's see if we can put some extra oysters in there and jumpstart it. And they had a NOAA grant, and they started partnering with other people, and everything kind of kept moving forward. And if you fast forward from 2007 to 2020, I graduated, I have another job, I still work at Baykeeper, and Baykeeper has now kind of taken over part of the Reef, along with our partners in the Billion Oyster Project, still New York City Parks, the Hudson River Foundation, the Bronx River Alliance, Rocking the Boat, and several other groups that help us out. The Reef went from this small, like 3x3 square to now it's going to cover a 5-acre footprint. Currently, right now, it covers 1 acre. That is not one continuous solid acre of oyster shell, but it's spread out in patches over an acre, which is important. We want to give the oysters room to grow, but also make the environment very natural. We now have a permit to expand that to 5 acres, which will be the largest project in New York City. It's going to start soon. As you know, things are kind of a little crazy right now with COVID, but we're supposed to be getting started at the end of the summer. And it's going to use these gabion structures. It's going to use some loose shell, some extra new ideas that we're working on. And okay, yes, there are managers, there's data collection, all this, but a huge part of this is outreach and citizen science volunteers. I can't do everything on my own. I am woman enough to admit that I need help, and the citizen scientists are our biggest allies. Having everyone come out, you can see in all these pictures, most of these people are volunteers. I don't pay any of them. They come because they want to do it. They get up at 6 in the morning and come out and meet me, and we go in the water. We pull up the baskets. We look at, we measure the oysters. We measure the progress. Are they growing over the summer? You can see on the right side, this is all the things we do. Now, we don't do this every single time we go out, but over the years, we've collected all of this data. We know about the invertebrate community that lives there, all of the small animals. We know about the fish and the crabs. We know about how the shell size affects recruitment. Do you want to have little mashed up pieces of broken shell, or do you need the big shells? Spoiler, you need the bigger ones. We know about survivorship from the time they're spat through if we put adults in, how are those surviving? We look at reproduction. We have tried all of these new methods of materials there, looking at the gabions, the cement structures, even putting tiles out to see if we can find spat. We've done all of this through citizen science, through the volunteers coming out. Whether it's large groups from like an organization or single people that come and make friends. I've had dates set up on these things. People love coming out. It's really important that we involve the citizen science in this, because you need a connection to it. Why do you want to come out in the water? Well, maybe you'll convince a friend to do it, and maybe by getting involved in oyster restoration, you'll do something else that triggers another behavior change. Maybe you'll not use a plastic straw, or maybe you'll want to go plant trees in New York. But all of this kind of eco-volunteering stuff is great for the environment, and it's great for you too. It's great for your mental health. I always feel better when I'm out there, even if I'm tired. And so, like I said, we were very fortunate to be part of this new project that Governor Cuomo is putting out, and we're going to have a nice expansion of the Soundview Park Reef, which is very exciting. So over the years, so I've been, like I said, I've been working there since 2007, And we've done different projects over the years. There's been, first we went from this one small reef to 2 small reefs. Then we had like a half acre or quarter acre reef. Then we went to the 1 acre. And throughout all this, we're collecting data. We're going from one data to the next, and we keep collecting it. And over the last couple of years, I've really synthesized a lot of this data with some students, and we found out that there is a large community of organisms that use the reef, right? Our oysters are doing well. The reproduction is not that great, but they're surviving. But it's really who they're bringing to the reef that we don't see not on a reef. We find multiple species of crabs, including blue crabs. We find small crustaceans like hermit crabs. We're finding amphipods and shrimp, okay? Polychaete worms, which are tiny little marine worms. We're finding transient fish and resident fish. So transient means they're kind of using the reef as a stopover. They're just swimming around. We found eels there, which are migrating down from the Bronx River. That's a big eel on the top there. The eel is always the big show for the volunteers. Everyone loves when we catch an eel. They're huge. But it's learning about all of these organisms that's the meat and potatoes of this restoration project. It's getting out there and seeing that this stuff is in your backyard. You didn't even know it was there. You probably may not care about some of it, but it's all important to the oysters. The oysters need this diversity around them. They need all these other organisms to help the reef stay healthy. Okay. So like I said, one of the most important things, I'm not going to throw too many charts at you, I promise. But one thing that's really important to study is the reproduction. And this doesn't mean that you have to make gonad slides and like get a microscope and learn about if your oyster was a boy or a girl. There are ways to kind of monitor it and see a proxy of, are you restoring? And one of those is called condition index. Condition index is this really easy tool that you can use because all you have to do is weigh your oyster wet and dry it in a special oven or a regular oven at 60 degrees Celsius. And then you weigh it dry and there's a formula you can calculate. We have done sexing of oysters, and unfortunately, it has yielded some results that are a little troublesome in that we don't have a lot of females. So oysters are what we call sequential hermaphrodites. When they're small, they're boys, and when they're big, they're girls. It is very energetically expensive to be a female oyster. It costs a lot of energy to make eggs. So if you're small and you don't have a lot of energy because you need to grow still, you put less energy into gonads, so you have sperm. When you're bigger and you don't need to grow a lot, you can put more energy into your gonads and you can make eggs. Okay, so they kind of switch over middle of it. The ones we're finding are mostly males. Okay, you need to have a lot of females because you need those eggs. Okay, we know that they're reproducing. We see it in this drop. So if you see where all those red stars are, their condition index was high and then it dropped. Condition index measures what's the meat of the oysters, like the tissue, versus the shell capacity. If they have a lot of tissue in there, it means they have a lot of eggs or sperm inside. And when they release all that, they shrink. So it's like a giant weight loss pill. Okay? When they lose all of that, their condition index is going to drop because they're going to have less tissue. And so you see this decline. And we can kind of back this evidence up by seeing that when we go out about 2, 3, 4 weeks later, we're finding those spat that would have spawned at that time. We're seeing them, okay? We're not finding a lot of them, but we're seeing enough that we can kind of backdoor match these two up, okay? It's very important for an oyster reef to be able to produce spat because you don't want to have to keep putting money into a restoration project. This is making it a self-sustaining population, and that is the goal of it, right? It is really, like, you've heard the expression needle in a haystack. That is exactly what looking for spat on an oyster reef is. You can see how small they are. I focus and I put the red circle around it so you can see they're very small, very flat. You really have to examine each shell very closely. Okay. The other thing I wanted to show you is that we have been doing a lot of studies about what lives on the oyster reef. And we're seeing that as we went in 2014 and we monitored the reef for a few years post restoration, so post putting in all of this new shell, we saw that there was this initial bump in species diversity, and now we're seeing it stay stable. So what we're hoping is when we add this next layer of the reef, we're going to again see this diversity increase as we make the reef more complex, as there is more of a 3D nature to these shells. we're going to see that restoration is going to lead to a species increase. As we're going through this, the citizen scientists and I, we're refining our techniques every year, and we're seeing that the better IDing is leading to more species. So things that we thought were species A were actually species B. And so we're kind of fluctuating over the years, but the hope is that we've spent these last few years kind of refining our techniques. And now when we go forward and monitor this next phase, we're going to see a nice jump. You can see that there was a nice jump from what we collected in 2007 to after we put this acre reef in 2014. So we are increasing the species every time. We have learned a lot since we put this oyster reef in, and we want to share that because we want to show how oyster restoration is doing in the Northern Harbor. Oysters are growing, they're surviving, they're not reproducing so great, and we're having low recruitment, which could be two different things. They could be reproducing better than I'm thinking, but the spat, the larvae, is getting washed out of the system, which means we need to study the flow of water around the area. It also could be that they are reproducing low, and so we're not recruiting also because there's just not a lot of egg and sperm in the water column. So those are two things that need to be focused on in the future a little bit more. We are seeing the diversity, the fish, the macroinvertebrates, the scavengers, all there. And we're seeing this increase in citizen science. I have way more volunteers in 2018-19 than I did in 2007. Okay, so people want to come out to the reef. They're extremely interested in learning about this. We kind of function like a little mini lab. We get a lot of college students, both from my university and from local New York universities. And even I've had people from Cornell, from Harvard, that are home on summer break and want to do research. It's a great way to get involved. I'm always happy to run a research experiment with someone, so that's awesome. One of the last things I want to talk about is biodiversity. So we've talked about why we want to restore oysters to New York Harbor. We've talked, oh my God, I've talked a lot longer than I thought, Sally, I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
We've talked about why we want to restore oysters to the harbor for all of those ecological impacts. And biodiversity is a really important one. A healthy ecosystem has more different species working together, especially when we talk about fish and crabs. We want those bigger scavengers in there. We want the fish moving around. The mudflat is like a barren desert. It's like an underwater desert. There's not a lot on top. And so by adding the vertical structure that these oyster reefs add, we're creating a habitat. Think about comparing the amount of species you would find on your lawn in the grass to like an actual forest, right? The forest has layers. You have trees that pop up. So you're going to see more species. And so it's these changing communities. They're going to lead to different interactions that's going to make the harbor itself healthier. And it's going to build up that shoreline so we can have the wave attenuation. Really quick blurb about plastic, because I know that's not the main focus. Plasticus litis there. We find a lot of marine debris, unfortunately, in the harbor. And the oysters don't mind it. We find them setting on everything. But in addition to doing studies about oysters, we do look at microplastic research. Oysters are a prime target for plastics because they feed by sucking in water. They're filter feeders. And so any plastics that are in the water are coming into them. And so you can see we found some fibers floating around the Bronx River last year, and we also found those fibers in the oysters and mussels that were living in the Bronx River. And so it's really important that when people come out for the citizen science, we like to educate them about plastic debris as well, because this is all things that kind of connect to the oyster life cycle. We want the oysters that we put in to be very healthy, and so sucking in plastic doesn't make them very healthy. The next steps are always coming. Doesn't matter how long you've been in restoration, you're always going to want to do the next best thing. And working on living shorelines is like a big part of the next project. Working on building these reefs that are tiny little plots into like a connected reef to make the whole harbor. We can't just have one site. We need to connect these sites together so that the larvae are all shared. That's going to bump up the population itself. It's a big challenge working in this urban area. It is a challenge getting permits. It's a challenge getting money, funding. It's a challenge just the physical environment of the harbor. But citizen science and these collaborations with local scientists and local nonprofits that we all have is a great way to help increase the restoration value of what's going on at your site. So the other project that we have in Baykeeper is at Earl Naval Weapon Station. Why is it a naval weapon station, you might ask? Because New Jersey was not too keen on oysters a few years ago, and the only place they would let us put them was in a secure naval base where we could promise that no one was touching them. But it has grown to an amazing project. We have the largest permit in the Hudson River Estuary. It's up to 10 acres permitted, and we're slowly building up to that. An aquaculture facility. You can see our teeny tiny little baby oysters there onto a cinder block, the oyster castle. Meredith is on the call, but if you have questions, you can ask her, or her email's there. She loves talking about Earl. And that's my email. Unfortunately, I don't know when we're going out next. Right now, everything's up in the air. It's very important to stay healthy and safe, and it's hard to social distance with eco-volunteering. You're kind of in close quarters. So we're waiting it out, and not going to go out until we have a plan for safe volunteering. But if you join our mailing list, I will definitely let you know. And I hope to meet some of you in person as the time comes closer. And I am happy to take any questions.
So, Dr. Fitzgerald, based on your work, where have you done most of your work in preserving these oysters, and what are you doing to bring them back to areas like in New York Harbor? And people are saying that that people are wondering that they can eat them again, and then they'll be famous in New York. What would you say?
So most of my work was actually based out of Soundview Park. My whole PhD thesis was in Soundview Park and Jamaica Bay. So I've been around in New York Harbor for a long time. I would not recommend you eat them. I think you might get sick. And that is my personal opinion and the official company byline. The oysters that we put in are for ecological restoration only. We don't want to eat them. There is a lot of bacteria in the water. There is other contaminants. We know that the oysters can take metals out of the water. We found mercury in them. We find cadmium in them. It's not recommended that you eat them. We have found people poaching at sites in New York, which is unfortunate. And a large part of the grants that we have and the projects we work on is based at outreach. It's to inform the public that this is not your best idea. This is why you shouldn't do it. And this is why we are doing restoration. And we're very fortunate to partner with a lot of local nonprofits like the Bronx River Alliance, who does a lot of the education work, and the Billion Oyster Program, who does like school education that teaches the kids and the citizens that live around Soundview Park, hey, you shouldn't go in the water and take those out. We want to build up this reef for science, and you taking them out to eat them is not helpful. That was a good question, though.
I have a question. Well, first of all, Allison, thank you so much. This was so great and so informative. And
you're welcome. Sorry I talked so long.
No, it was great. It was fantastic. I grew up in Soundview. So from I was 2 years old until I went to high school, my second year of high school, I lived on Taylor Avenue and Story Avenue. So that's right there in the Monroe Projects. So I'm familiar with the neighborhood, but it was just so great to hear all about this project and the Soundview project. My question is, the people in City Island, from our from what I've been hearing from a lot of the local boating community, is you talked about the reef growing up. And a lot of questions that we've gotten with the CIOR is that people are concerned that have their boats and the yacht clubs, that they're going to that the reef is just going to grow up and it's going to hurt the boats from navigating through the waters. Can you speak of that?
Yeah. So Sally and I have actually talked about that when they were talking about putting permits together. One of the permits that you have to get to start a reef is, because you're in what's called navigable waters, there's a lot of permitting from the Army Corps, and they'll take that into account. An oyster reef, even if you have the healthiest, most amazing oyster reef in New York City, will grow slowly and it won't accrete up that fast. So you're not talking this is going to happen in 2 years. But if you are using these structures that we talked about, whether it's the oyster castles, the concrete structures, or the gabion metal structures, that's going to add, but it's going to increase your height of your reef. You want the reef to be at a certain height. It has to be a minimum of I think like 6 inches above the substrate to get a proper reef going. I can check into that number. But if there are studies that look at ones, you don't want them too tall because then the waves are like not going over it, but you don't want it too small because then it's too low to the sediment. I think if you put this in an area that at a low tide is a minimum of like 5 feet, you will have no problems with the boats. I don't know a lot about boats, like what type of boats you have there and how deep they are, but you want these to be subtidal. You want them to be below the water for the majority of the time. The ones we have in Soundview are just barely subtidal. At a extremely low, the lowest tide of the month, it's like ankle high, maybe like 6 inches of water, okay? But most of the projects are subtidal where they have divers go down or we attach like a ring to the baskets and bring them up. So you don't want, if you are in an area that has a lot of boat traffic, you want to consider having a more subtidal reef and putting it in a deeper spot. But that's something that the permitters will talk to you about, and you want to get those, if you can talk to the people at your boat club and find out about the types of boats they have, that would be great information to have for when the permitters ask like what depth you're looking at. I'm guessing these aren't like ginormous yachts or anything like that. So
No, they're mostly sailboats and stuff.
yeah, so they're not too
ginormous.
deep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not too deep.
Thank you.
Of course. If you want to email me later, that's totally fine. I know it's hard to ask questions on these things.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for your amazing presentation, and for the folks here on City Island. We are so excited to build our own reef that we imagined a big, long reef. I'm not sure how long that'll take us, but I know that where there's a will, there's a way. And we have
exactly
a huge bunch of oysters that come out of our restaurants. Do you and Soundview have a source for oysters? And do you think that given our, I guess, source of all these restaurants, do you think that that will place us at an advantage for growing our reef faster? And also, we're just really interested in learning from you in order to help our project move along.
Shell? You mean a source of shell or like live oysters?
Shell.
Okay, so shell has to be cured a certain way. There's a specific DEC protocol that you have to follow. I will totally call her out on this, but I will
have a permit and we're doing.
Oh yeah, no. So we don't cure our own shell for Soundview. We get it from the Billion Oyster Project. Whenever we put shell in, it's either clam shell that's been purchased from distributors like north of us that we know is cured properly, or this next phase is going to be oyster shell that's from the Billion Oyster Project. We used to have a curing site in New Jersey, which I don't think we're using right now after Sandy, it got destroyed. There is a lot of by-state non-friendly laws. It's very hard to take things from New Jersey and put them in New York and vice versa. And so our shell curing was in New Jersey all that time, so we had to use a New York source. So thankfully, our partners have a good shell recycling program. And if you guys have your own shell recycling program, and I know you have the protocols, then that is a great source of shell to put into the reef.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. About substrate? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I don't know.
Substrate preferences. Outside of oyster shells, which I mean I know is the preferred, but I mean you just talked about it's difficult to get them sometimes and to have the quantity that you need to create this big reef. Have you found a substrate preference in oysters so far? Even just anecdotally, like do they prefer the tiles or the cement or the castles?
So I actually had a friend who did this study last summer. They took clamshell that were both cured the same exact way, and they didn't find any difference in the growth of the oysters, the amount that they set. But there is a lot of studies that talk about using artificial substrates versus actual shell. So like tile. The cement that we use isn't like you picked up a cinder block at Home Depot. It's this special cement called EcoConcrete. It has extra additives in it that mimic the calcium carbonate in a shell. So it's that they're attracted to that calcium carbonate. That's part of why why ocean acidification is so bad, because it's breaking down that calcium carbonate. But we haven't seen a difference, and I'm pretty sure, I don't remember any recent studies that have looked at that there's been a difference between different types of shell. Surf clam has been widely used because yes, it is hard to get oyster shell. Surf clam is really big. They like that big cup part of the shell, and so that works really well. All of the projects that were pre maybe 2016 or 17 in the harbor were all on clamshell, and it's worked well. And like you said, it's volume. We put 100-something thousand tons of shell out last time for 1 acre. Yeah. That's a lot of oyster shell. Yeah. I know that they've been curing shell on Governor's Island and on Staten Island for years, and like they're up to a very large amount now, but it takes a long time to find those. And so yeah, you guys with your restaurants, I know you've been curing for a while, and that is awesome. A lot of projects will mix the shell types too. So if you don't have the proper volume of oyster shells, they'll mix the clam in with it. But if you're more interested in that, if you send me an email, I can definitely find some papers and some studies on that.
Yeah, because I'm really curious about the artificial substrates just because of the difficulty of finding the volume. I mean, you need a lot, and it's hard to find that. So I'm curious.
It's these mixed media projects are really, I like them the best. I think that we have promising results from that, where you intersperse the metal and the concrete and the loose shell, and everything kind of has a place in the reef itself, and those are giving us really good results.
Okay, cool.